Asia News.
In 1940, SOE had set up an organization which would spread its secret networks into the heart of occupied Europe. But on the other side of the world, in the Far East, the peace was also threatened. Japan was poised to invade the rich European colonies of Southeast Asia. Already stretched to the limit in Europe, SOE was to face a new challenge and to take up arms with strange comrades. In 1940, the Japanese were already at war with China. It was just one stage in their plan for a Japanese empire spreading thousands of miles into Asia and the Pacific. When France fell, they pushed into French Indochina, adding to their gains. It would be a useful launching pad in the military gamble which was to follow. Vichy French leaders weakly agreed to peaceful occupation and use of their airfields. By March 1941, the Japanese were just a few hundred miles from Malaya and the naval base of Singapore, poised for their first step into British territory. Japan had long set her own sights on Europe's colonial treasures. Malaya was an especially glittering prize, supplying half the world's rubber and tin, resources which had become vital in wartime. Malaya's exports passed through Singapore, Britain's principal naval base in the Far East, crucial to the security of Southeast Asia. In a city already teeming with secret agents, SOE set up the Oriental Mission, its first outpost in the Far East. Headquarters were in the Cathay Building, Singapore's first skyscraper. A training school was set up at a remote spot on the coast in a millionaire's house. Tin miners, planters and civil servants came to learn SOE skills. SOE also planned to recruit local people from the mixed community, Chinese, Indian and Malay. If the country fell, they would harass the Japs, working in secret behind the lines. But the proposal was turned down flat by the authorities. The governor declared it was bad for the Oriental mind to suggest the Japanese might win. Military chiefs condemned the plan, but even SOE thought the action would be elsewhere.
In fact, the top priority really was to try and get something moving into China. So we were very busy trying to get a route up the Burma Road into China and people there. And then Hong Kong seemed very urgent to us. So we helped with organizing a stay-behind party to stay in the new territories in case of an attack on Hong Kong, which everybody expected.
SOE slipped agents into Hong Kong, Thailand and Indochina. While in Singapore, the British built up defenses. A comfortable feeling of security prevailed. But military chiefs underestimated the skill and cunning of the Japanese. Troops and equipment were poured in, but they were not enough. The British Army in Malaya lacked tanks, artillery and wireless. Singapore was to be defended in the air by Buffalo fighters. They were hopelessly out of date. Churchill put his faith in the Navy. He sent 2 battleships, one his pride and joy, the Prince of Wales. It was too little, too late. In September 1941, the Japanese had made the decision to go to war against the Allies. They knew they must make a first strike to succeed. And soon after dawn on December the 7th, the Japanese struck at the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. American losses were huge. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese destroyed or damaged 18 ships, 347 planes, and killed or wounded 3,500 men. At the same time, Japanese troops invaded Thailand and Malaya. General Yamashita put in 3 divisions of his finest troops. They were more than a match for the new recruits who faced them, conscripts from Britain trained, like their generals, for war in the desert or the fields of Europe. The Japanese knew how to fight in the jungle. The British did not. And as British troops retreated, the Japanese came after them on bicycles. Unorthodox tactics and more than a match for the hidebound British military. It seemed there was no obstacle to the Japanese advance. Within 4 days, the Japanese had complete air supremacy. Churchill's mighty battleships had been sunk. Japanese troops were only 500 miles from Singapore, with little to stop them. SOE was given the go-ahead rather late in the day. They turned for recruits to the Chinese community in Singapore. With a tradition of secret societies, they were well suited to clandestine work, and SOE knew they were anti-Jap. They already had an anti-Japanese organization collecting funds for the defense of China. Now that war had come to Malaya, thousands of Chinese had already joined a local militia, eager to avenge Jap atrocities in China. SOE chose recruits already skilled in underground warfare, in the Malayan Communist Party. Until June 1941, on Moscow's orders, these men had waged war against the British, fomenting strikes and trying to undermine the British war effort. But when Hitler invaded Russia, communists throughout the world had been ordered to back the Allies. A deal was done. Communist prisoners were released from jail to join SOE. The first group was picked up from a street corner in Chinatown and taken to Jim Gavin's training school. They were apt pupils.
When these communists arrived, they were all frightfully young, sort of teenagers, with no ties at all, ready to do anything, quite intelligent, very fit. So they were, and very disciplined. They did exactly as their cell leader told them. So they were easy to train.
SOE began to plant small groups of Chinese guerrillas in the Malayan jungle. As their positions were overrun, their job was to harass the Japanese and to report on enemy troop movements. There was no time to lose. The front line came closer every day. Meanwhile, SOE's Freddie Spencer Chapman was at work on another plan. His target, a bottleneck 50 miles wide between Kuala Kubu and Kuala Lipis. All the major roads and railways ran through it. So too must the Japanese. Boris Hembry, a planter, was one of his recruits, selected to go there and attack communications.
The test was very easy. It meant if you looked a big enough idiot to join such a funny outfit, then you were in. In about 2 days, we got all our stores through the great help of a man called Gavin, who raided several quartermaster stores, and we got what we wanted. Freddie Spencer Chapman saw us off, and his last words to me were that I shall be up and join you in 2 days' time. That was the last I saw of Freddie until end of May 1945.
With jaunty disregard for the approaching battle, they set off, Freddie driving his own rather flamboyant transport. Between them, the 8 groups had one wireless transmitter, the only one to be had in the entire Singapore mission. Embry's group took it and spent their first night in a police station.
We slept in the cells, I remember, because there were bunk beds there. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, we were awakened by a man shouting out, "Who are you and what the hell are you doing?" So we got out. We saw a British officer in a jeep. And we said, "What's the trouble?" He said, "Well, what are you doing here?" So we told him. He said, "Well, do you realize the Japanese are a mile away, the line has been broken, and that the only thing you have between you and the Japanese is an anti-tank gun?"
Embry abandoned the comfort of the police station and took cover in the jungle. Meanwhile, Spencer Chapman had gone to join his own party 15 miles away at Sungi Sempang. They had found an excellent site near a power station, ideal for a base camp. From the power station, a pipeline ran up into the jungle, and at the top, they made their camp. But not for long. Chinese bandits raided their stores, and then the Japanese arrived. Freddie decided to abandon the camp and walk the 15 miles across jungle-clad hills to join Embry. Sapper John Sartin was in the party. For him, the walk became a nightmare.
Once we'd lost our footpath, it was absolute murder. It was just full of leeches and mosquitoes by the million, and they're at you all day and all night. But these leeches, they had teeth in, and they used to stick in your hand. Well, if you pull them off, they pull the skin off too, and left poison in your skin. But you had to force your way through, and the only thing we had was one parang between the 3 of us. And it meant taking turns chopping the stuff down so we could get through.
But Freddie's party never caught up with Embry. As they struggled across the main range, the Japanese overran Embry's position. British troops, routed at Slim River, had withdrawn. The road south, littered with the debris of a retreating army, had been cut. Embry's supply dump had been raided by bandits. Wireless and money had gone. They had no option but to call the whole thing off.
Not only had we no Freddie Chapman, no leader, no plans, no maps, but now we had no guns, no arms, no food, no clothes, nothing. We got to get back and rejoin the British lines as quickly as possible. But the British army were in lorries, going back at the rate of 40, 50 miles a day. We were on our flat feet. At the most, we could expect to do 5. In the event, sometimes we didn't do 1. Then it started to rain. It rained, and it rained. We were sopping wet in minutes. The going was getting even worse, and we had found ourselves in a thorn jungle. Our skin was ripped to pieces, our clothes were ripped to pieces. There was no point in going back. We had to keep going.
Finally, they gave up the protection of jungle cover for the comfort of easier paths. They took to plantations and even main roads.
Not one person gave us away. It was absolutely remarkable. Now, I put that down to the fact that we could talk the language. We could joke, and we did joke. We told them this is a temporary setback. The British Army will be returning in about 3 weeks or less than a month. Little did I know it would be 3 3/4 years.
Embry was lucky. He managed to escape by fishing boat to Sumatra, thence to Singapore. But what of Spencer Chapman? With his two companions, Freddie was trying to salvage what he could of his original plan. They set out to attack bridges, roads and railways, classic SOE targets. But the tropical heat gave them frightening problems.
If you left gelignite in the heat for any length of time, nitroglycerine would run out of it. And if it hit the floor, it would explode straight away. So we got hold of a piece of bamboo, very similar to this. If you notice, every so far down the length of bamboo, there's a joint. And right through that joint, it's like a solid bottom to it. And it's like a jug, actually. So what we used to do was put our gelignite in there, drop the detonators in, and put the switches on, and stuff the top of it with grass turf or soil. And if you tie a piece of string around that and a piece around the bottom, you can put it on your back. The only snag with that is if you happen to stumble or have to jump a ditch, the vibration inside would set the gelignite off, and that would have been the end of you see. So we put our gelignite in the middle of the road and put branches around it to make it look as though it had fallen off the back of a lorry.
For 2 weeks, Chapman and his saboteurs roamed the Malayan countryside. Japanese convoys had to reckon with the ingenuity and daring of the SOE team. The three men showed what might have been achieved by SOE's original plan for stay-behind parties. In one mad fortnight of sabotage, they derailed 8 trains and blew up 15 bridges. They held down over 2,000 Japanese troops, killed or wounded at least 500, and destroyed over 40 motor vehicles. But short of explosives, their sabotage spree was at an end. Like the Japanese, they took to bicycles and headed for the coast.
We came down the Gap Road and we found 3 sandbag walls 6 foot high stretching across the road. There was a gap in the middle, and just as we were going through this gap in the wall, I heard a yell behind me. I turned around and there was a bayonet about half an inch from the back of my neck. And then they stood up on both sides of us. They must have been waiting for us, I think.
Sartin finished his war in a prison camp in Thailand. Only Freddie managed to escape into the jungle. Of 38 men who went in, all but 4 were caught or killed, or died in Japanese concentration camps. And then the unthinkable. Singapore fell to the Japanese. "100,000 Allied troops were trapped on the island, outfought, outflanked, and outgeneraled. They were publicly humiliated, forced to line the route as the Japanese rode in triumph through the streets of Singapore. In 10 weeks, the Japanese had all but achieved their ambition, an empire in the Western Pacific. Some SOE men managed to escape, among them Richard Broome and John Davis. They had installed the Chinese communists in the Malayan jungle to be the front line of resistance. A third was Ivan Lyon, who was later to pull off one of SOE's most daring coups in the Far East. Lyon had been given the job of running an escape route through Sumatra and islands off the Malayan coast. It had been used by hundreds of escaping civilians and Allied soldiers. Now it was used by the SOE men. "18 men packed into a tiny boat designed for coastal waters. Lyon was navigator. For 10 days they made slow progress along the coast until they ran into their first storm. John Davis recalls.
The Tanah Johannes, a Malay trading prau, had been built saucer-like in order to be able to operate in shallow waters. The result is that a tremendous roll set up. In fact, we really thought at one time that we were going to roll ourselves completely over. And then, horror of horrors, the water, which had been stacked in kerosene tins all round the mainmast, began to break loose. There was only one thing to be done. We all, except the steersman and perhaps one other, and there were 19 of us aboard, rushed down to the bottom and formed a tight scrum around these kerosene tins, and there we stayed in that position for, I think, well over an hour, until the swell had abated to some extent. And in doing so, we were able to save about 2/3 of our altogether pressure water.
The little boat ploughed on at the mercy of squalls and the Japanese fleet. Near Ceylon, they were attacked from the air by a Japanese plane. No one was hit, but there was more to come. Richard Broome.
Another aircraft came over, and we assumed it would be a British one. So instead of concealing ourselves, we all rushed on deck and waved and cheered, and then we suddenly saw the rising sun on the wings. And he circled us several times, but he didn't fire. And we came to the conclusion that he must have been off an aircraft carrier. And sure enough, this was the Japanese fleet, which had raided Colombo and was on its way back. And we worked out that we almost sailed right through the middle of the fleet in the middle of the night.
The little boat carried them 1,500 miles to within sight of Ceylon. After 5 weeks at sea with food and water nearly gone, they were picked up by an Allied merchant ship and carried to safety. Broome and Davis went to a new base in India in an old fortress near Poona. Within its ancient walls, they made plans to return to Malaya. Meanwhile, SOE survivors agonized over reasons for their recent failure.
To go in with 2 days' grace was completely and utterly useless. And in retrospect, when I realized the number of parties that were put in, at least 4 or 5, I think, and every one failed only because the bureaucracy of Singapore and the higher-ups would not allow Freddie Chapman to organize these parties right from the beginning, even before the war started, because it would upset the morale of the native population to think that Singapore and Malaya are going to be overrun.
Wireless. We had no wireless. That would have made all the difference. Of course, I don't want to make too much about this wireless, because hardly anybody had any efficient wireless in those early days in 1941. But what a difference wireless would have made to us to keep touch with these people. Or even if we'd had air. But you see, we couldn't do any supply dropping. We couldn't move anybody about by air because the Japs had complete air supremacy.
The Indian Ocean now lay between SOE and Malaya. They had no aircraft to cross it and no wireless contact. The country was out of reach and deserted by its British masters. Yet SOE's job was to organize resistance to the Japanese inside Malaya. John Davis began work with Limbo Seng, a Singapore businessman. Already involved in resistance, he'd been forced to escape. In Chungking, the Chinese capital, he found willing recruits for SOE. They were soldiers and students born in Malaya, anxious to return and fight the Japanese. Limbo Seng brought them to SOE's camp in India to train with Davis and Broome. By summer 1943, SOE's Force 136 was ready for Malaya. Transport was provided by the Dutch Navy in a submarine. Thus, John Davis found himself 5 miles off the coast of Malaya in his SOE canoe.
The captain said, "Now get off, then I'll twist the submarine to point exactly the direction you're to take, and then I'll fade away." And it was quite a dramatic moment when he had done that, and glancing behind us, we saw and heard the gentle throb of the submarine, fading, 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 until we were on our own. We were about 300 yards from the shore when suddenly the land breeze brought the perfumed, heavy air of Malaya back to us. That with the very gentle swish, swish of the surf. And I think we all sort of opened our chests and said, "My God, this is just like being home again."
It was the first British landing on Malayan soil since the humiliation of Singapore. They buried their wireless and other gear and crept inland. With their white skins, Davis and Broome were conspicuous. They would have to stay under jungle cover. Meanwhile, Agent Ah Tsing had gone to nearby Pangor Island to buy himself a boat, the only means of communication with the outside world. Undercover as a fisherman, he had a second job, vital to the success of Davis's mission: to make contact with SOE's communist guerrillas, left in hiding by Broome and Davis before Singapore fell. Davis heard they collected funds from local fishermen. He gave orders to Ah Tsing: buy your way in.
结果他们一队队人员又多一点钱，我刚好嘛，我就跟他讲，我可以给你们多一点钱，可是你们要找陈平来看我。
Chen Ping was leader of the local communists and in touch with party chiefs, a vital contact for Davis. To gain Chen Ping's confidence and to prove his own identity, Ah Tsing took him to the beach where the party had landed and dug up supplies they had buried there.
这个无线电呐、机关枪信案呐、爆炸炸药啊，他原来你是联军的，我你就是联军来找你嘛。后来陈平就很相信我，他说现在还没有公开的时候，你还是带我回你那个队里面去。
Chen Ping brought news of the 7 communist groups left behind in the jungle by SOE. They had expanded into a military organization calling itself the MPAJA, Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, with units throughout the country. Chen Ping's men began to work with Davis, smuggling the extraordinary news of this ready-made force to SOE. Once a month, the fishing boat set out for the open sea beyond Pangor. At 9 Mile Island, it rendezvoused with an Allied submarine. Agents and messages were exchanged in somewhat unconventional ways.
We used to write our reports as small as we possibly could and roll them up. And then it was a question of keeping them free of weather. And we had, I can't think why we had them, but I suppose this was thought of before. Anyway, they were put into a French letter. And then they were concealed in various ways. One was at the bottom of a full tin of Andrew's liver salts. And the other one, which I thought was the best of the lot, was in the brain pan of a big dried fish.
But rumors of the SOE mission had reached Japanese ears. Davis and Broome decided to abandon their camp near the sea and move further inland, closer to the communist guerrillas. Chen Ping and his men escorted them on the perilous journey across 60 miles of occupied territory to a new hideout deep in the jungle.
To our surprise, we found a complete camp, beautifully made, all ready for us. A guard, an MPAJA guard, all ready. This was fairly early in the war, so the food was good, and we settled in there really very happily.
Davis now put relations between SOE and the communists on a more official footing. He held a meeting at the camp with top party officials.
They were obviously suspicious, and they weren't prepared to give very much. So we thrashed out a bit of an arrangement. You see, the trouble was that we obviously weren't going to discuss what was going to happen after the war, and they were very interested in that. They didn't want the British back or anything like that. But whenever they raised this problem, our only resort was to say, well, we're just soldiers, we don't know anything about the war at all.
Nevertheless, Davis had gone into Malaya representing Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander, with authority and orders to make terms.
They wouldn't give us a direct command of the guerrillas, but they would take the orders of the Allied commanders over any fighting, and we, on the Allied side, would get them arms, money, and medicines. So we had, in effect, got a complete agreement with them for cooperation, with a strong feeling on all our parts that this was something we were all going to stick to.
Meanwhile, Lim Bo Seng's other Chinese agents were setting up their own network in the towns. They operated undercover as coffee shop waiters and businessmen, collecting intelligence. The key man worked from this shop in Ipoh, posing as a black market dealer in food and gold. It was dangerous work for which they had not been trained. The agents were getting uneasy. In March 1944 came the first clear signs of trouble.
我们出来借潜水艇的地方呢，就九岛屿那个地方呢，借潜水艇已经失败了，已经借不到了。也发现的敌人来跟我们，跟这个我们借艇的人的这潜水艇来跟我们这个碰头了，那这些问题呢就越来越紧张了。
Agent R. Lim became jumpy. The Japanese had moved onto Pangor Island in force. He feared the network had been blown.
25号晚上。 我就在李茂生住的地方跟他同一个晚上。那个晚上，我跟他要求他离开，要求到我流泪，我哭，他没有办法。他说：“林，最后的就是林，你听我的命令。”
Next day, R. Lim was arrested in Ipoh at the Oriental Hotel, his warnings unheeded. Art Singh had already been caught and taken to this house in Ipoh for interrogation. But he managed to escape while pretending to take a bath.
我就在里面，穿着拿出来，叮叮咣咣，就打开水龙啊，就用洗澡的方法，好像洗澡一样了。然后，其实水管有开，人没有冲凉，我就从那个船门就这样慢慢出来，就从3楼跳到2楼。 2楼就透到地上。
He managed to escape in a pedicab. Risking recapture, he went to report that the network had been destroyed.
Well, he told us that the thing had been discovered at the Pangor end, that somehow or other the Japs had got hold of this Taki who'd been running the fishing boats for us, and he had told them what he knew. We always knew he would have to if he was caught by the Japanese. There was nothing else he could do. We never blamed him about that. But from that, they got a line on all our agents outside, including Lim Bo Seng. There we were. The whole of our organization had perished.
It was our fault in a sense that we had to rely, we'd had to make the fatal mistake of relying on one line of the communications. And all this sort of thing, you should rely on 2 or 3 different lines, but we just hadn't got a different line. So that as soon as the Japs broke into the one, the rest followed, one after the other.
All links with the outside world had gone. Now began the worst time for Broome and Davis. Forced by the Japs to move further inland, their new camp was often damp and unhealthy. They were completely cut off from SOE, unable to keep the submarine rendezvous, their wireless still buried on the coast. For nearly a year, they were trapped in their jungle camp, guests of the communists on whom they depended. Most of the time, they were ill, laid low with malaria and dengue fever, trying to stave off the worst effects of malnutrition, living off what they could find in the jungle.
The great thing was to keep up our vitamin C, which we were able to do by getting tapioca plant tops, the light leaves, and also the leaves of sweet potato. I think because of that, we were able to avoid any bad attacks of beriberi. In addition, we usually managed to get up from, despite the troubles and difficulties, from the plains, a little, very scrubby little dried fish, a wonderful fish paste called blachang in Malay, which is really crushed, and I should have thought almost bad, shrimps. But it is the most finest thing possible to eat with just plain rice.
至于这个老鼠啦、青蛙啦、蛇啦，这些是我们在湖上这个好的这个鱼吃的，不多，我们时常要很辛苦了才能够抓到这些东西。那么有一次啊，我们看到3只狗离开它们很远的时候，我们就把它算野狗这样杀掉来吃。那么煮来吃，大家都 尤其是梦游，他们吃了都说很好很好。他说不晓得是狗肉来的。
There was very little chance of being attacked by the Japs, and if we had been, we always knew we could get away. So the battle was really against boredom. I made a chess set, and then I made Monopoly. The Chinese would do anything for a gamble, and they got hold of this, and they thought it was wonderful. And there we were in the depths of the Chinese jungle, in the depths of the Malayan jungle, with our Chinese solemnly buying Mayfair and putting up hotels on Piccadilly and that sort of thing. It really was a fairly outlandish event.
The great thing we all felt all the time, that we were surviving and we were free. I remember one time I went down to a ladang, that is to say an aboriginal clearing below us to collect some of these sweet potato leaves, and I lay out, and a Jap plane flew right across the sky, high up, nothing to do with me, and I said to myself, by Jove, we're really the luckiest people in the world. We're free, we can go where we like, and think of all our friends, because it was 95% of our friends were all locked up in Singapore. So we were really very lucky.
At last came a breakthrough. The communists brought them their wireless equipment from its hiding place on the coast, suffering somewhat from burial.
The batteries, of course, were completely dead, non-existent, hopeless, had rotted away. They'd been in a swamp for about 9 months, I think. And the panel generator and the dynamo were just a thorough rusty mess.
The communists were helpful, but slow.
Time and again, they got batteries up to us, which were dud, and the dynamo came up, and that was dud, had to go back. This meant a month or two at a time wasted.
Ingenuity won the day. They rigged up a bicycle generator to charge the batteries.
When you can imagine, there are about 6 of us, usually rather ill and weak people, trying to keep this bicycle going flat out all day. And yet the day came when we managed to get sufficient to make a transmission. Li Chun, the operator, was an extraordinarily patient fellow and plugged away, and on the 5th attempt, he got through. And we were in communication with the outside world.
In Colombo, SOE celebrated with a dinner party. They'd long since given them up for dead. But to be sure that Broome and Davis were not in enemy hands, they tested them out with a riddle about 2 strange characters called Titus and Tamsin.
Now, Titus was John Davis's nickname, because he had a very big bottom, in fact, was the reason for it. And Tamsin was my wife's name, which is a sort of fairly unfamiliar type of name. So we had the task of replying to this in a way which would really convince them. So John just replied, Titus is here, and says Mrs. Dickinson, which was the person who invented that name for him, apparently. And I said, leave my wife out of this. Well, that was a good start. But then we thought, well, we mustn't do something a bit more convincing than this. And we finished off by saying, are you satisfied now, you bastards? If not, come and peddle the bloody machine yourselves. Well, that really was a masterpiece, because no Jap could have invented that. And so they had another dinner party in Colombo, and all was going well after that.
Broome and Davis were back in business after nearly a year. Elsewhere in the Far East, SOE had already been active. A former comrade had sailed right into the jaws of the enemy in a little fishing boat. He had already proved his nautical prowess on the voyage from Sumatra to Ceylon. It was Ivan Lyon. Lyon had resolved to hit back at the Japanese, who'd captured his wife and baby son. From a base in Australia, he devised an audacious plan. To sail 2,000 miles across enemy waters to the islands of the Singapore archipelago. From there, to mount an attack on Japanese shipping in Singapore harbour. The military scoffed, but Lyon persisted. He raised a crew of 14 men, Australian and British, soldiers, sailors, and men from the outback. The voyage was to be made in an old Japanese fishing boat, the Crate. She had already seen active service, ferrying refugees before Singapore fell. On September the 1st, 1943, she sailed from Australia on Operation Jaywick. On the 16th, they were within 20 miles of Singapore Harbour, the first Allied vessel to enter those waters since the surrender. Lyon and a chosen team of 5 officers set off in 3 canoes. For several days, they hid among islands south of the harbour, secretly observing Japanese shipping. On the night of September the 26th, they made their silent attack. Techniques learned in the lochs of Scotland were put to good use in the warmer waters of Singapore. They went through the drill. As one man steadied the canoe, the other set the fuse, slipped a mine down on its placing stick, and snapped the magnet against the hull. They set the fuses to give themselves 3 hours to get away. From the safety of nearby Dongus Island, Lyon observed with some satisfaction the results of their night's work. They had sunk nearly 50,000 tons of Japanese shipping. Back in Melbourne, congratulations flowed in. The Japs had been given a bloody nose on their own doorstep, but Lyon was already planning a second, more daring raid. He turned to SOE in London for backing and for less primitive means of launching the attack. Baker Street did not fail him. SOE's Walter Chapman was conducting trials of a new prototype, the Sleeping Beauty submersible canoe. It was just what Lyon needed. After a test run in Staines Reservoir, he ordered 15. More battles with authority, and Lyon got the go-ahead. He returned to Australia to raise a new crew. 6 of them veterans of Operation Jaywick. This time they travelled in comfort in a Royal Navy submarine with their precious Sleeping Beauties. On September the 23rd, 1944, they surfaced in the archipelago, a year since Jaywick. Lyon spotted an old junk, the Mustika, just what he needed to sail close to Singapore. Without much persuasion, the Malay crew handed it over. With the Sleeping Beauties stowed on board, the scene was set for Operation Remount. The crew of Porpoise gave 3 rousing cheers. But it was the last anyone was to see of Lyon and his crew. After an encounter with a Japanese patrol boat, Mustika was scuttled. Lyon and his men took cover on the islands, but were relentlessly pursued, and Lyon killed. Those captured were beheaded in a Japanese prison. But elsewhere in the Pacific, the Americans had begun to hit back in the biggest naval battle of all time. It was autumn 1944, and throughout the Far East, the Allies were on the offensive. In Burma, the tables had also been turned. The Japanese had suffered their first major defeat on the Indian border. In some of the worst fighting conditions of the war, they were being driven back. Despite the horrors of the monsoon, Allied armies pushed on relentlessly. By the end of 1944, they were set to liberate the whole of South Burma. The Allies had learned the lessons of jungle warfare. They were poised to invade Malaya. In Colombo, SOE was preparing to send in more men to back the invasion. A second mission had already gone in to the communists by submarine from Australia, but new possibilities were opening up. SOE could now reach Malaya by air. Based at Trincomalee in Ceylon was a fleet of Catalina seaplanes. Stripped down to bare essentials and with extra fuel tanks, the Catalina could just fly the long journey to Malaya and back. It would take 30 hours to do the round trip. For its first airborne mission, SOE chose a group of Malay officers. Assured of Chinese support, it was anxious to secure backing from the Malays. But the noisy Catalina was not best suited to clandestine operations. The first moonlit attempt was aborted when the pilot spotted enemy shipping. They tried again 3 days later, having well and truly alerted the Japanese.
When we came out second time, they were more or less ready, waiting for us. I felt so disappointed at not doing anything. Therefore, I decided that I would try to fool the Japs by pretending to be working with them.
Locked up in this house, Ibrahim worked out a risky plan to turn the tables on his captors. He agreed to work for them as a double agent. They brought him his wireless set. Watched closely by his guards, he tapped out his first message to SOE, secretly adding a code which told them he was in Japanese hands. Deception branch took over and began a game with the Japanese. The Japanese captain fed Ibrahim false information to mislead the British. But they too were cooking up misinformation. They told Ibrahim of plans for an Allied landing on northern beaches. He passed this on to the Japs, who moved up troops in readiness. The invasion was indeed planned, not for the north, but the south. It was a complex game of double bluff. While Ibrahim played it, SOE wondered, would other Malays risk their lives, like him, in the resistance? SOE had begun to supply John Davis's guerrillas, but they did not want the Chinese communists to be the only conquering heroes. The question was, had Malays accepted the Japs?
Of course, with the arrival of the Japanese, there came also the huge Japanese propaganda machine that provided the kind of story that all would be nice and golden and things would be cheap. As things went by and supplies were cut off and there was not enough local food supplies, then of course food became very scarce and clothing became very scarce. And people began to question, began to wonder, what on earth is all this after all the big promises?
Japanese rule had brought hunger, torture and death to all Malaya. It was not only the Chinese who longed for an end to the Japanese empire. SOE cast its net in the northwest, near the frontier town of Grik. Colonel Peter Dobry led the first mission to the Malays. Response was overwhelming.
Saya mula-mula dengar perkabaran tu daripada abang saudara saya, itulah Mat bin Mat Piah. Iaitu dia bekerja sebagai ketua kampung di Basia Lama. Beliau memberitahu kita sekarang sudah senang sikit. Pasal apa, kita tentera British sudah pun turun perecut di Padang Cermin.
Apabila saya masuk di kamp tu, saya kagumlah tengok dalam kamp tu barang-barang macam mimpi lah. Segala mesin jahit, segala pistol, segala senapang, segala macam-macam barang-barang makan. Kemudian saya tengok ke atas siling ni, dia punya peracuk tu beratus-ratus ada.
Feeding all the recruits became a problem. Dobry sought help from a local man.
Dia kata paksa nak guna kau kan nak pakai budak-budak gerila ni banyak. Sampai sepuluh-puluh, sampai beribu budak gerila ni. Dia kata bahagian daripada Colombo tak cukup.
He bought food secretly at night and used his father's elephants to carry it to the camp.
Maklumlah masa-masa Jepun tu bahaya. Bahaya besar lah. Taklah sebut orang kata potong bunuh, potong kepala tak tentu.
The Malays spread rumours that there were thousands of British soldiers in the jungle. The Japs became jumpy. They knew that scores of Malays had gone into the jungle to join the British, so many that some of the villages were deserted. The Japanese threatened to make an example of one small kampong by taking away its rice. Without it, the villagers would starve. But Peter Dobree and his guerrillas came to the rescue and hid the rice. As they rested from their labors, weariness overtook caution. They were rudely awakened by the Japanese. Ismail bin Limbut was there.
Pukul 5 pagi lebih kurang, saya jaga gak situ, tunggu situ, buka kayu tu. Lekan, Jepun sudah masuk ikut sungai ni mari. Lekan saya beritahu lah kan, dia kabar, ambil kabar semua, lekan beritahu penguluran ni dia tembok. Tembok tu kan belakang Tuan beri sana, dia lawan ikut sungai pergi bawah. Lekan dia lawan sana, dia kena peluru sini. Lekan saya pun ingin ambil kabar lagi sini lah.
Dobree was forced to withdraw. But meanwhile, 3 other missions had gone into the Malays. One led by Major Douglas Richardson. Guided by relays of Aboriginals, he was on his way south down the Perak River to towns and villages in the heart of Malaya. At this safe house on the edge of the jungle, he met a man who would be key to the building up of a Malay army. As assistant district officer in nearby Raub, Yop Mayadin had close contacts with the Japanese and was trusted by them. He could travel freely and meet people without suspicion. Thus, he had already raised his own force of 60 volunteers to fight the Japs. These men would now have new jobs with the Japanese as spies for Richardson.
We managed to insert people to work in with the Japanese garrison as cleaners, drain cleaners, and telephone operators, and all odd jobs.
Yop raised an army of Malay recruits and Richardson trained them. They too were ready to back the British, as SOE had hoped. August 1945, preparations mounted for Operation Zipper, Malaya's D-Day. Over 5,000 Chinese communists waited in the jungle to be armed. The agreement drawn up through John Davis was now honored. Weapons, ammunition and explosives were flown in, and over 500 SOE men. A secret army waited in the Malayan jungle. Even the Aboriginals had been recruited. SOE had come to depend on them. They acted as guides and kept watch on the Japs. They cleared sites in the jungle to receive supply drops. They ferried arms and ammunition. Hundreds of tons of stores were hidden in the jungle and kampong houses as Malaya awaited the call to arms. Then, unexpectedly, the war was over. Within days of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese leaders in Tokyo surrendered. In the uncertain dawn which followed, Peter Dobree's men crept out of the jungle. Unsure if news of peace had reached the Japs in Malaya, they crossed the Perak River. In the tense days before the British Army reached Malaya, SOE men took on a new role as guardians of an uneasy peace. Communist guerrillas came down into the towns and began to take the law into their own hands. Japanese troops turned policemen. John Davis found himself between opposing ranks of Japanese and Chinese communists.
In the early morning, there was a sound of rifle fire. So John looked out, and sure enough, these two lots were shooting at each other. And John had a Union Jack by that time, which he stuck on the end of a stick and walked out into the street waving it. And stop the battle. It was really straight out of Kipling almost.
At last, the surrender became official. Throughout Malaya, SOE officers attended the ritual handover of swords. Now it was the Japanese turn to be humiliated. But as the celebrations began, the Japanese threat began to give way to a new one. Jungle and town were now filled with thousands of well-trained and armed guerrillas sporting the 3-star badge of the communists.
We had to reckon with those groups of people who were armed by the Allies, but in fact whose loyalty was to Moscow and to China. There was the group of people called the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. And they came out in places where they could control the villages and the townships. And they held their own kangaroo courts and so on. And it became one of our responsibilities, our group of people, to protect the public, so to speak.
There was no doubt that the MPAJA was subject to a new command. With the war over, they were officially disbanded, paid off, and in theory, disarmed. But they were preparing now for revolutionary war against their colonial masters, the British. Within 3 years, former comrades had turned enemy. Tactics learned from SOE were used as communists fought to seize power in Malaya. SOE had armed communist guerrillas throughout Europe and the Far East. In Malaya, the British themselves had to face the consequences. To win a war which had threatened the freedom of the world, a Pandora's box had been opened. After 8 years of bitter fighting, John Davis met his wartime comrade Chen Ping, now leader of the communist guerrillas. It was a vain attempt to reach agreement. Did Davis and Broome now regret SOE's wartime decision to back the communists?
I can honestly say I don't think either John or I ever had the slightest doubts about their helping us during the war. If there had been real fighting and we'd had to fight our way back into Malaya, I'm quite convinced that there would have been a great deal of help from these chaps because they had camps situated above the lines of communication right down the peninsula, and they could have played hell with the Japs, and there would have been no hanging back. They would certainly have done that.
After the war, SOE was disbanded. It had shown the world the power of guerrilla warfare and brought modern refinements to an ancient art. Since then, guerrilla movements have flourished, backed by governments who fear to fight openly. For better or worse, SOE had shown the way. The world lives with the consequences.
Malaysia News.